The distress signal began as a faint whisper cutting through the endless void, a flickering pulse lost among the stars. Then it surged, screams, crashing metal, frantic shouts overlapping as if thousands were dying at once. The Vox operator aboard the receiving frigate recoiled as the signal burst into clarity. The sound of lasfire crackling and terrified guardsmen yelling for backup. Somewhere behind them echoed a monstrous screech, wet and layered. Like a beast with too many throats, static tore through the transmission as something massive slammed into a bunker wall. The voice of the dying world trembled through the Vox, like a soul begging for salvation. This was no ordinary distress beacon. It was a final cry before extinction. Heavy breathing filled the channel, ragged and desperate, accompanied by the scrape of armor dragging across broken stone. The operator tried to isolate the voice, but the transmission kept fracturing under waves of psychic interference. Shadows moved in the background of the audio. Wet footsteps, chitin grinding, the awful squelch of flesh being pulled apart. Several guardsmen screamed in unison, their voices rising in unholy harmony, as something ripped them away mid-sentence. Their weapons fired wildly, hitting nothing but the walls around them. Then came a roar so loud it distorted the signal. A sound filled with hunger, triumph, and a terrible intelligence. The ship's crew stared at the Vox unit, horrified, afraid the sound itself might breach the hull. The survivor's voice finally broke through the chaos, trembling with exhaustion and terror. He sounded young, far too young to face such a nightmare. "Command, any Imperial forces, please," he gasped, choking on dust and blood. Behind him, the ground rumbled as if the planet itself was shifting. A sickening clicking noise echoed, like claws tapping against stone, closing in. "They're everywhere," he whispered, the words barely audible. "They came from beneath, from inside the walls, from the people." His breathing accelerated into frantic psalms. "The whole world! Emperor, save us! The whole world is already theirs." A piercing shriek drowned him out, so sharp it made the Vox operator's ears bleed. The audio spiked violently as something grabbed the survivor. The Vox picked up every horrifying detail. The crunch of stone under inhuman weight, the scraping drag as he was pulled backward, the survivor's boots scrambling against the floor in a hopeless fight. His cry turned guttural, primal, as claws pierced through flesh. Then came a chilling moment of clarity, a final whisper, trembling and broken. "The Imperium is already too late." His words collapsed into a sob, followed by the wet cracking sound of bones bending the wrong way. A roar thundered through the channel, rising like a storm of hatred. The signal blurred into static, but the sound of something feeding remained painfully clear. And then silence. The signal cut so abruptly it felt intentional, as if the planet itself wanted the Imperium to hear only enough to sow dread. The Vox room remained frozen, every crew member pale and trembling. In that moment, they understood. This was no invasion, no uprising, no simple Xenos attack. This was the death scream of a world already consumed, and whatever had taken it was still hungry. The void was silent when the Imperial Liberation Fleet emerged from warp, but the silence felt wrong, thick, heavy, pressed with an invisible weight that crept into the bones of every soul aboard. Before them hung the planet once designated Vandros 9, now shrouded in a veil of blackened clouds and writhing shadows. Where cities once glittered with imperial light, only organic spires remained, towering, pulsating growths stitched into the crust like cancerous wounds. Tendrils of alien biomass spread across continents, glowing faintly with a sickly rhythmic pulse, as if the entire world were breathing. Even through reinforced void shields and kilometers of armor plating, the ship crews felt the wrongness emanating from below. It was not simply a conquered world, it was a world devoured. In the command deck of the flagship Gloria Invictus, astropaths knelt in a trembling semicircle, their blind sockets weeping blood. They whispered in broken, terrified fragments, clutching their temples as psychic echoes poured into their minds. Millions extinguished. No, consumed. Their screams still echo. No silence, never silence. The senior astropath collapsed, convulsing as if her soul were being pulled out through her skin. The ship lights flickered. A psychic shockwave rolled through the deck like a frigid wind, carrying with it the faintest trace of despair, so profound it felt ancient. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Even battle-hardened veterans felt sweat bead under their collars. Something on that world was still alive. Something hungry. Lieutenant Thor stood near the viewport, staring down at the corrupted sphere. He had fought tyrannids, orcs, even chaos-tainted abominations, but this was different. There was no pattern, no logic, no recognizable mark of a known enemy. The alien growths formed twisting arches, spirals, and massive crater-sized veins that glowed with internal fluid, pumping like arteries across the land. Thor felt the dread crawl behind his breastplate, a cold, suffocating pressure. He tried to steady his breathing, but each inhale felt heavier, as if the planet itself were exhaling into his lungs. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his combat blade. Fear, he realized, pure and undiluted. Not the fear of dying, Thor knew death well, but the fear of something the Imperium had no name for. Magos Andrelic delivered his grim report. Vandros X emitted bioenergetic signatures, unlike any known Xenos cataloged by the Mechanicus. The surface was overlaid with a planetary-scale living network, growing still, expanding even in vacuum-exposed regions. The world is not dead, he rasped through Vox static. It is transforming. Vox operators struggled to maintain stable communications. Strange interference slithered through every channel, as though the planet whispered back. The fleet admiral ordered full combat readiness, but no one moved with the usual confidence of the Imperial Navy. A world overtaken was tragic. A world transforming into something else was horrifying. None dared say it aloud, but every officer felt it. They might already be too late. Thor exhaled slowly, forcing discipline back into his shaking muscles. This mission was no longer a liberation. It was a descent into a nightmare. The moment the landing order came through, he bowed his head in a silent prayer to the Emperor. The planet below pulsed again, as if sensing their approach. As the strike craft prepared to launch, Thor whispered to no one but himself, "Whatever waits down there, it already knows we're coming." The Imperium had cataloged countless horrors across the millennia. Tyrannids that consumed all biomass, orcs that waged endless war, Eldar whose cruelty spanned stars. But nothing on Vandros 9 matched any known strain or species. Magos biologists called them null pattern entities, a classification reserved for nightmares that defied logic. The Xenos did not arrive from the void. They grew from beneath the planet's crust, erupting through stone and metal like tumors breaking skin. Their shapes defied consistency, elongated limbs one moment, swollen masses of muscle the next, shifting and folding as though sculpted from melted flesh. Sensors detected a whispering frequency woven through the air, a psychic drone that felt like 1,000 distant voices murmuring in unison. Not chaotic like the warp, worse, purposeful, intentional, alive. Each creature was a grotesque collage of stolen humanity. Embedded across their bodies were faces, hundreds of them, half-formed, stretched, or folded into the alien hide, like desperate prisoners trapped under a translucent veil. Their mouths gaped in silent screams, lips trembling even when the Xenos stood motionless. Their eyes followed movement with a pleading consciousness, suggesting the absorbed victims were not fully dead, merely trapped in an eternal paralysis. Some faces were fresh, their skin still recognizable. Others were twisted into expressions of torment, fused into the flesh as if liquefied and reshaped. The Imperium had seen bio-abominations before, but never ones that kept their victims awake inside the monstrosity that consumed them. The creatures communicated through a hive-mind whisper, a layered chorus impossible to interpret. All Imperial translators failed. Even psychers recoiled, swearing the whispers came not from the creatures alone, but from the entire planet, as though Vandros 9 itself had become a sentient organism. Wherever the Xenos gathered, they erected towering monuments fashioned from bones, twisted spires constructed from the skeletons of their victims, cleaned with impossible precision. These bone towers pulsed faintly with psychic energy, radiating fear like a beacon. Marines who approached them reported hearing disjointed human voices calling for help. One squad recorded a whisper that repeated a child's lullaby in perfect low Gothic, despite no children being found alive on the planet. Imperial forces soon realized the Xenos did not simply kill, they harvested. When one creature fell, its corpse melted into a slurry of red and black tissue that seeped into the ground. Minutes later, a new form rose from the soil, larger and more complex, as if it had evolved from the death of the previous host. They adapted instantly to weapons, shifting their density to deflect bullets, liquefying their limbs to slip through cracks, or sprouting new appendages to counter threats. They were a perfect mixture of biological horror and ritualistic intelligence, something between a hive species and a cult. Every encounter showed new variations: winged horrors, crawling masses, towering brutes, all connected to the same whispering mind. The Imperium could not classify them, could not predict them, could not comprehend their purpose. All they knew was this: every scream absorbed, every body taken, every bone tower raised made the planet stronger. These Xenos were not invaders. They were the world itself, reshaping into a predator, and humanity was merely its final meal. The Imperial scouting team descended through the toxic clouds in a battered Valkyrie, their visors fogging with condensation as they approached the twisted terrain below. The landing zone had once been a manufactorum square, now buried beneath layers of fleshy growths and bone-like protrusions jutting from the earth. As the ramp lowered, a suffocating silence greeted them. No wind, no movement, only the faint pulse of the ground, as if the world had a heartbeat. The squad spread out with disciplined precision, Auspex units humming softly. Readings were flat, empty, as if the planet contained no life at all. Then, without warning, the screens erupted, thousands of heat signatures, overlapping shapes, impossible clusters of movement surrounding them on all sides. "This can't be right," muttered Sergeant Hale. The next moment, the ground beneath their boots shifted. The ambush erupted from everywhere at once. The soil split open like a mouth, spewing forth tendrils that lashed around troopers' ankles, dragging them screaming into the darkness below. From above, the ceiling of a collapsed hab block bulged outward before bursting into a cloud of gore as elongated limbs slithered out, wrapping around a trooper's torso and pulling him into the structure. What looked like corpses, bloated, decomposing, began to twitch violently. Their chests tore open as Xenos creatures spilled out, still dripping with half-digested organs. Las fire scattered across the area, but the aliens shifted into gelatinous forms, bullets and beams passing harmlessly through parts of their bodies. The Vox filled with overlapping screams, static, and the first whisper, "Join us," spoken in the stolen voices of the dead. Sergeant Hale tried to rally his men, but one by one they were dragged away, torn apart, or simply swallowed whole by the living terrain. One creature lunged from beneath a pile of corpses, its body a writhing mass of human faces sewn into a serpentine shape. It wrapped around Trooper Varric, every face opening its mouth in silent agony as their teeth sank into him. Hundreds of tiny bites shredding flesh in seconds. Another horror, tall and skeletal, with limbs that bent in wrong angles, pierced a guardsman through the spine and lifted him slowly, savoring the twitching as it whispered the man's own prayers back to him. The squad's heavy gunner unleashed a torrent of fire, screaming, but the Xenos simply flowed around the shots, reforming as if mocking him. Within minutes, the scouting team was reduced to chaos, blood spraying across the pulsating ground, limbs torn free, armor crushed like paper. A creature emerged from the earth beside the last 3 surviving guardsmen, its body splitting open to reveal a cavity filled with twitching organs and half-digested remains. It surged forward, swallowing one whole with a sound like wet canvas ripping. The second survivor impaled a Xenos with his bayonet, only for the blade to sink into liquid flesh. The creature wrapped around his arm, dissolving metal and skin alike. Sergeant Hale was the last to fall, yanked into a bone tower where his scream was abruptly cut short. Only a sickening crunch remained, echoing through the ruins. Only one guardsman remained, bleeding, crawling through the muck, half mad with terror. The whispers followed him, gentle and patient. "Join us." They echoed inside his skull as he dragged himself toward the extraction beacon, leaving a long smear of blood behind. He did not look back. If he had, he would have seen the ground opening, dozens of eyes watching him go, not chasing, merely waiting, because they knew he would lead the Imperium to them. The Imperial Marines advanced through the ashen remains of what had once been the capital hive of Vandross 9. Their boots sinking into a carpet of soft, fibrous tissue that pulsed faintly beneath the surface, like muscle responding to touch. Auspex scans confirmed the unthinkable. Nearly 98% of the planet registered as biologically compromised, meaning it was no longer terrain, infrastructure, or even stone. It was living matter. The city's towering hive blocks were twisted into obscene shapes, their metal frames fused with alien sinew that crawled upward like veins toward the smothered sky. What used to be streets had become fleshy canals, filled with thick fluids that slithered toward the horizon as if obeying some hidden heartbeat. The Marines had fought on corrupted worlds before, but this was no corruption. It was consumption at a planetary scale. The deeper they pushed, the more undeniable the truth became. Every trace of civilization had been swallowed. Hab units were wrapped in layers of organic growth, their windows sealed shut by membranes that twitched when touched. Statues of imperial heroes were reduced to bone scaffolds, their stone faces dissolved into nutrient paste. The air tasted metallic and thick, vibrating with faint whispers that brushed against the Marines' minds like cold fingers. At a ruined transit station, they found a monolith of fused armor. Hundreds of breastplates, pauldrons, helmets melted into a mound, each marked with regimental insignias from across the continent. The armor inside still contained shapes that twitched. The Marines silently prayed this was only death and not something worse. Their worst fears were confirmed when they reached the remains of an evacuation bunker. The heavy blast doors had been peeled open like the rind of a fruit, exposing a chamber filled with rows of restrained humans, men, women, children, all suspended in cocoons of translucent flesh. Thick tubes were embedded into their spines, drawing glowing fluid from their bodies into the walls themselves. The victims were alive, eyes fluttering weakly, mouths opening in silent pleas. Their skin had grown thin and pale, stretched tight over skeletal frames as the alien structures drank their vitality. Every heartbeat was siphoned away, transferred into the world's growing biological network. The Marines cut down as many as they could, granting mercy through the Emperor's peace, but they knew it was hopeless. This was not a prison. It was a harvesting system. Across multiple cities, the same nightmare repeated. Entire hives stood transformed into pulsating towers of repurposed flesh and bone, their foundations cracking under the weight of the alien biomass that fed on them. Imperial pict captures showed vast pits where thousands of civilians had been thrown into melting pools, their bodies dissolved into nutrient slurry that nourished the planetary organism beneath. Children were fused into the walls of their own homes, hands reaching outward as if frozen mid-escape. Soldiers from local regiments were found in clusters, strung together by tendons like macabre decorations, their eyes still flickering with faint consciousness as the Xenos used them as energy reservoirs. Every corner of the world echoed with the same conclusion. Vandros 9 had not fallen. It had been rewritten. When Tech Marines analyzed the biomass, the revelation chilled even their enhanced hearts. The planet was undergoing a complete physiological transformation, its core shifting, its crust hollowing into chambers of unknown purpose. The alien network was converting the planet into a singular, massive organism, a biological superweapon capable of launching itself through the void or detonating in a psychic shockwave strong enough to cripple entire sectors. The hive mind whispers confirmed this intention. They were not defending territory. They were preparing birth. Every human absorbed fed the planetary metamorphosis. Every soul drained strengthened the pulse beneath their feet. Vandross 9 was becoming something alive, intelligent, and monstrously hungry. The Imperium had arrived not to save a world, but to witness its final evolution. As the Marines withdrew to report their findings, they passed a nursery, twisted into a fleshy cavern. Small shapes hung from the ceiling. Children, still breathing, their bodies dimly glowing as the Xenos fed on their dreams. One Marine removed his helmet, eyes burning with grief. "Emperor, forgive us. We're too late." Above them, the planet pulsed again, stronger than before. Vandross 9 was no longer dying. It was awakening. The squad moved through the shattered breach of the once proud city, now transformed into a living nightmare. The buildings no longer stood rigid and cold. Their surfaces expanded and contracted in slow, rhythmic waves, like lungs inhaling stale, toxic air. Windows blinked, membranes stretching over them like eyelids, trying to hide the horrors inside. The ground beneath the Marines pulsed faintly, each step sinking half an inch into a soft, fleshy layer that warmed disturbingly under the pressure of their armored boots. These were not ruins, they were organs, molded into the shape of a city. Even the air felt moist and warm, carrying a low hum that vibrated through armor and bone alike. The squad advanced in tight formation, every instinct screaming that they were walking through the body of something impossibly large and undeniably alive. The deeper they pushed, the more the streets lost all resemblance to anything human. Pavement gave way to stretched layers of living skin, veined and pink, quivering at the slightest touch. The Marines tried to step on metal debris or broken stone whenever possible, but the city seemed determined to swallow those remnants, pulling them slowly into itself like a creature digesting scraps. Each footfall left an impression that slowly healed behind them. Sergeant Vorton muttered a prayer under his breath, the words trembling as the sound of faint breaths rose from beneath the ground. It wasn't wind, it wasn't machinery. It was the city exhaling, the warm breeze brushing their armor like the sigh of a dying giant. And every exhale carried a faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakably human. The walls around them became worse. Beneath shredded layers of alien flesh lay faces, stretching, straining, screaming silently through translucent tissue. Thousands of them, fused into the organic walls like tortured murals. Some were fresh, eyes wide and rolling wildly inside their fleshy prisons. Others were pale and sunken, their features frozen mid-scream. A few still had lips visible, mouthing prayers or pleas the Marines could not hear. When Brother Scout Melkin brushed his gauntlet against the wall, a dozen faces turned toward him at once. Their mouths stretched wide, emitting a faint, muffled cry that resonated through his helmet. Melkin stumbled back, heart pounding, swearing he felt cold fingers brush along his neck. The squad marched forward faster after that, each man forcing himself not to look at the living tapestry of suffering around them. They entered the central plaza, expecting at least some structural stability, but found only deeper madness. Corpses littered the area, except none were truly dead. They twitched, spasmed, whispered through torn throats. Some reached out with trembling hands, begging for help in hoarse, broken gasps. Others were fused into pillars of muscle and bone like grotesque statues, their bodies half melted and absorbed. A soldier pinned to a wall by sinewy tendrils turned his head toward the squad, tears streaming down his grime-covered face. "Kill me," he croaked, before the wall tightened around him, crushing his ribcage with a wet pop. One Marine fired a mercy bolt into another struggling victim, only to watch the wall absorb the corpse instantly, pulling it deeper into the biomass with a greedy slurp. The squad knew then, nothing could be saved here. As they navigated a corridor of pulsating bone arches, the psychological strain worsened. The hive mind whisper became clearer, threading directly into their skulls. "Join us. Join the whole. Become one." The Marines' helmets filtered sound, but the whispers came from inside their minds. Shadows moved along the fleshy walls, shapes shifting just out of sight. Every breath felt thick, as though the air itself wanted to crawl into their lungs. Brother Selnak froze mid-step, swearing he heard his mother's voice calling his name from inside the walls. Seconds later, a malformed hand burst outward, grasping at him with desperate strength. The Marines hacked it away, but more hands followed, small ones, children's hands, scratching at their armor, begging to be freed. The squad advanced with bolters ready, but even their weapons felt powerless against such anguish. At last they emerged into a chamber where the city's organic growth met a massive vein pulsing like a titan's artery. The floor shuddered, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a rising chorus of hunger, pain, and pleading. The Marines realized the awful truth. They were not exploring a ruined city. They were walking through the circulatory system of a newborn planet creature, and it knew they were inside it. As the walls tightened and the floor began to rise, the squad retreated in silent terror, each man understanding that this world was not dying, it was feeding. Thor moved through the sewer tunnels with his weapon raised, the dim lumen lamp casting trembling shadows against the slime-slick walls. The stench of rot and chemical decay clung to every breath, thick enough to taste. Then he saw them, human figures huddled together behind broken pipes and rusted grates. Their eyes were sunken, faces streaked with filth, fear, and exhaustion. When Thor stepped closer, a woman flinched as though struck. She clutched a ragged scrap of cloth to her chest, rocking faintly. Thor recognized it at once, a child's blanket. Her voice cracked as she whispered that her children had been taken, dragged to the absorbing pits where their bodies and souls were fed to the living world above. Her grief hit him harder than any Xenos attack. It was a wound carved straight into the heart of humanity. Behind her, another survivor shifted into the light, a ragged guardsman with haunted eyes and trembling hands. His armor bore the scratches of frantic struggle and the stains of dried blood, but it was the look on his face that froze Thor. Shame. The man confessed in a shaking voice that he abandoned his regiment during the first wave, leaving his brothers to die as the Xenos surged like a tidal wave through the trenches. He survived only because he ran deeper into the tunnels, locking the hatch behind him while the screams echoed above. Thor wanted to condemn him, to shout, to call him a coward, but he couldn't. This world had broken braver men. The soldier's voice cracked as he admitted he would rather be shot than keep living with what he'd done. His guilt was a weight, pulling the entire room downward. As Thor listened, the mother's voice returned in a fragile whisper. She described the pits, massive fleshy hollows, where the Xenos lowered captives alive. The victims didn't die immediately. They were absorbed, their faces stretching across the walls, their minds trapped in silent torment. Her children had screamed for her until their voices were swallowed by the living biomass. Thor felt something inside him fracture. He had seen horrors on 100 worlds, but this was cruelty built with precision. He knelt beside her, placing a hand on her trembling shoulder, but he had no words. There were no reassurances left. The Imperium might save the planet, might purge the Xenos, might reclaim the land, but nothing would undo what had been taken from her. Nothing would fill the void carved out of this broken mother's soul. The time in the tunnels grew heavier. The survivors showed Thor carvings on the walls, desperate marks left by others who had hidden before them. Names scratched until fingernails broke, prayers etched with broken knives, final words painted in blood. Some messages begged for rescue, others begged for death. Thor felt the weight of every lost life pressing down on him, as though the air itself carried the planet's mourning. The guardsman who had betrayed his regiment read each carving with visible agony, whispering apologies to names he didn't know. For the first time since landing, Thor's resolve wavered. Was the Imperium even fighting to save lives anymore, or simply to contain a catastrophe? The question gnawed at him, hollowing out his certainty. Yet he forced himself to stand. These people needed hope, even if it was just a lie he would tell with his presence alone. The mother guided Thor deeper into the tunnels, showing him where others had tried to escape. He saw charred remains near a collapsed passage. Survivors burned alive when the Xenos flooded the tunnels with corrosive spores. There had been no chance, no mercy. She explained that the creatures didn't just consume flesh, they fed on emotion. The stronger the fear, the faster their growth. Thor felt cold settle over him. This enemy didn't merely conquer worlds, they harvested despair like a resource. The guardsman clenched his fists, insisting he wanted to make things right, to fight again, to die with purpose instead of shame. For a moment, Thor believed him. For a moment, he believed they all could be saved. But the distant echo of chittering voices reminded him that hope was a fragile thing on this cursed world. Every second counted. When the survivors asked Thor what awaited them if they reached the Imperial lines, he hesitated. How could he tell them the truth? That even if they escaped the tunnels, they still faced a battlefield drowned in living flesh, skies clogged with biospores, and Xenos that moved like shadows. He forced himself to answer anyway. The Imperium would protect them. The words tasted like ashes. Yet the mother looked at him with a flicker of belief, and the guardsman straightened his back, as though given a reason to exist again. Their fragile trust cut deeper than any accusation. In that moment, Thor realized something he had long ignored. The Imperium didn't fight only for worlds or territory. It fought for the scraps of humanity that still clung to hope, even in hell. And now that fragile hope rested in his hands. Thor promised to lead them out, even though his heart felt like it was splintering. The survivors gathered their meager supplies, preparing to follow him into the nightmare above. As they moved through the suffocating dark, Thor felt the weight of their stories anchoring itself inside him. Grief, guilt, loss, and the desperate, stubborn will to continue living. These were not soldiers, nor martyrs. They were the reason the Imperium still fought. And as distant tremors signaled the Xenos closing in, Thor made a silent vow. He would not let their suffering be meaningless, even if he had to tear the world apart to protect them. The sky burned as the Imperium's assault began. Drop pods streaked from orbit like falling stars, slamming into the corrupted surface with thunderous impact. Space Marines charged out, bolters roaring, their armor gleaming for only a moment before the shadows swallowed the light. The ground writhed beneath their boots, living flesh pulsing like a heartbeat. From every direction came the Xenos, shifting shapes that melted and reformed mid-charge, limbs twisting into blades, jaws splitting into rows of needle teeth. The 1st Marine Squad fired disciplined volleys, but their bolter shells sank into alien bodies like stones into water. The creatures simply reknitted themselves, shrieking with stolen human voices. Even the air trembled with their hive-mind whispers. As the Marines pushed forward, the battlefield itself felt alive, as if the planet were resisting every step. This was not a simple purge. This was a war against a world that refused to die. On the eastern flank, Imperial Guard regiments advanced in tight formations, their lasguns firing in frantic, flickering lines. But the beams did almost nothing. Each shot burned a tiny scorch mark into the Xenos flesh, only for the wound to close moments later. Guardsmen screamed as the shapeshifters broke through the first ranks. One soldier stabbed a creature again and again, only to watch its body liquefy, slide around the blade, and re-solidify behind him. Entire platoons were swallowed by flowing masses of alien biomass that surged up like tidal waves. Commissars shouted orders drowned by the chorus of death. Fear spread faster than fire. Some guardsmen dropped to their knees, praying to the Emperor. Others fired blindly, tears streaking down their dirt-covered cheeks. They weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a nightmare that refused to stay dead, a horror that laughed with voices stolen from their fallen comrades. To the west, the ground quaked as Titans entered the fray. The colossal god machines strode forward, each step crushing hills of flesh that writhed and screamed beneath their metal feet. Volcano cannons unleashed torrents of energy, vaporizing entire swarms in blinding explosions. For a moment, hope flickered, but then the horror truly revealed itself. The destroyed biomass began to regrow, slowly at first, then rapidly, tendrils weaving themselves back into humanoid shapes. Titans stomped again and again, each impact squashing hundreds, but the Xenos simply reformed, crawling up the Titan's legs like living tar. One Titan fell as its joints were consumed and fused together, its massive frame collapsing in a thunderous crash. The crew's screams echoed briefly before they were absorbed into the flesh. The other Titans roared in defiance, but even their godlike weapons seemed insufficient. This was a battlefield designed to break spirits, not bodies. Space Marines pressed deeper into the heart of the living landscape, but the Xenos adapted with every kill. Their forms shifted into mockeries of Astartes, twisted parodies wearing stretched-skin versions of power armor, bearing faces of the fallen. Bolter fire shredded them, but moments later, the creatures fused back together, their wounds knitting with obscene speed. Captain Ralthan of the Salamanders swung his thunderhammer, obliterating a creature into splattered gore, only to see the gore slither across the ground and reform behind him. The whispers in the fog grew louder. "Join us. Become us." Some Marines clutched their helmets as psychic pressure built, the hive mind trying to invade their thoughts. A librarian shattered dozens with a psychic blast, but blood poured from his nose as he fell to one knee, overwhelmed by the alien presence. The Xenos didn't just fight physically, they attacked the mind, the soul, the will to keep standing. Artillery barrages rained down from the sky, turning the battlefield into an ocean of fire. The explosions blew apart massive sections of the living terrain, sending chunks of regenerating biomass flying. But even the firestorm wasn't enough. The Xenos absorbed the flames, their bodies blackening, melting, then rising again like charred phantoms. Imperial aircraft streaked overhead, firing missiles that detonated with earth-shaking force, only to be dragged from the sky by tendrils that pierced their hulls. Thor fought alongside a squad of Marines, his armor splattered with blood, some alien, some human. He watched a guardsman torn in half, yet still screaming as the biomass pulled his torso into the ground. The hopelessness was suffocating. Every victory lasted seconds. Every effort felt pointless. But still they fought, because retreat meant extinction. And because in the Imperium, surrender was not merely forbidden, it was unthinkable, even in the jaws of death itself. Thor looked around and saw a battlefield drowning in madness. Marines surrounded by endless tides, guardsmen firing until their lasguns overheated, Titans collapsing under living mountains of flesh. Yet no one broke, no one fled. Even as the world reshaped itself into one colossal predator, the Imperium held the line with sheer, brutal refusal to die. Thor felt despair claw at him, but beneath it was something harder: rage. Humanity had suffered enough. He rallied the survivors near him, shouting for them to push forward, to carve a path no matter the cost. Blades flashed, bolters thundered, and for a moment, the unstoppable tide slowed. Not because the Imperium was winning, but because it refused to fall quietly. And in that sliver of defiance, Thor saw the beginnings of something terrifying for the Xenos. The will of a species that would burn a galaxy before letting itself be consumed. The battlefield burned and pulsed under the blackened skies, but the Imperium's forces began to notice a horrifying pattern. Bolter rounds that had once torn Xenos apart splashed against them harmlessly, leaving only shallow scorches that healed almost immediately. Plasma torches incinerated parts of their forms, only to see those sections split, multiplying into smaller, equally deadly variants that surged back into the fray. Flamers, once reliable for clearing corridors, now fueled the creatures, the heat accelerating their growth. Tech priests shrieked into their servitors' ears, frantically recalculating and adjusting weapon calibrations, but the equations fell short. The Xenos were learning in real time, adapting to every attack, bending biology and physics around the Imperium's most trusted tools. Sparks flew from overloaded power packs as heavy weapons teams watched with disbelief. Titans stomped, crushing hundreds of creatures at a time, yet the biomass reconstituted before their eyes. Each step forward seemed to trigger a wave of adaptation. Tendrils grew longer, claws split, spines twisted into barbs capable of piercing armor. Psychers screamed into their helmets as whispers invaded their minds, taunting them with promises of assimilation, threatening to rewrite the memories of those who resisted. Every tactic devised was immediately countered by the Xenos' instantaneous biological intelligence. Guardsmen fired en masse, and yet they saw their own dead raised and reshaped into abominations, wielding their lost rifles against their comrades. In horror, officers realized that even death no longer offered relief. The planet itself was becoming a machine of endless regeneration, learning from every wound, every strike, every scream. The tech priests ran calculations frantically, their cogitators sparking and whining under the strain of impossible math. "They are not a species," one screamed, voice raw and tinny through the vox. "They are a system. They are the sum of every attack, every countermeasure. Every kill only feeds their strength. Every weapon teaches them new forms. Bolters, plasma, flamers, they all accelerate adaptation." Servitors clattered desperately, raising shields, feeding power to weapons that had already failed. Some Marines clutched their helmets, muttering prayers to the Emperor, while trembling under the psychic onslaught. The Xenos had become a feedback loop, a self-correcting, self-replicating nightmare that no conventional strategy could overcome. The Imperium had come to cleanse a world, but instead they found themselves caught in a war against the concept of survival itself. In the Central Command Dome, a revelation emerged. The Xenos were vulnerable to one thing: sonic disruption. A librarian detected frequencies that caused momentary spasms across the alien biomass, disorienting the hive-mind connection and halting regeneration briefly. It was not a solution, only a weapon of timing and precision, a spark of hope in a battlefield flooded with despair. Sonic disruptors were few and required careful coordination. Any misfire would amplify the creature's resonance, accelerating their growth instead of halting it. The tech priests devised schemes to coordinate planetary arrays, Vox-guiding space marines to concentrate their sonic attacks at precise intervals. Every second mattered, every shot counted. Fail, and the Xenos would consume everything. Succeed, and perhaps the Imperium could finally stabilize the battlefield and claim a sliver of victory from a war that had felt hopeless from the first step onto the planet. Thor and his strike squad were briefed on the plan amid the chaos of the battlefield. Titans pounded the flesh hills, bolters rattled uselessly, and the air was thick with alien whispers. The librarian's voice cut through, explaining the timing, the angles, the necessity of precise coordination. The squad knew the gamble was extreme. Too early, and the Xenos adapted instantly. Too late, and the sonic pulses would arrive after millions had already been absorbed. Guardsmen shivered as they gripped their lasguns uselessly, watching the alien tide swell. Thor felt the full weight of leadership, knowing that the smallest mistake could doom the entire regiment. Every human casualty had become fuel for the enemy. Every split-second hesitation could mean annihilation. Yet despite overwhelming odds, the Imperium pushed forward, driven by duty, faith, and the grim refusal to yield. The first coordinated sonic pulse blasted through the battlefield, shaking the Xenos into spasms, fracturing some of the smaller forms. It was brief, a mere heartbeat of advantage, but it ignited hope. Marines surged forward, Titans hammered with renewed purpose, and tech priests recalibrated as quickly as possible. The Imperium had no guarantee of success, but in that fleeting moment, the impossible seemed plausible. The Xenos had evolved, adapted beyond expectation, but the Emperor's warriors had found a crack in the nightmare. Victory would demand every ounce of courage, strategy, and sacrifice, but for the first time, the battlefield shifted. The war against evolution itself had begun, and humanity had a weapon, however fragile. The tunnel stank of blood, sweat, and alien decay. Thor crouched beside the massive sonic warhead, its casing pulsating faintly as if aware of the lives it would end. The rest of his squad huddled near him, faces pale and grim under flickering lamplight. Above ground, the battle still raged, a cacophony of bolter fire, shrieking Xenos, and the distant thunder of Titans. Every second spent calculating timing, positioning, and range felt heavier, like stepping through quicksand. Thor's hands shook as he keyed the final programming. He looked at the survivors, the mother clutching the shredded remains of her blanket, the soldier who had betrayed his regiment, and a few others barely conscious. None spoke, none needed to. They all understood the choice: activate the warhead, and life as they knew it would end. Hesitation would doom them, and countless others above. The planet's pulse thrummed beneath them, impatient, hungry, indifferent. The mother stepped closer, eyes wet, hands trembling as she gripped Thor's arm. "End this," she whispered, voice cracking. "Let our deaths mean something. Let them not have taken everything for nothing." Her children's faces flashed in his mind, stolen by the absorbing pits. He felt every ounce of rage, despair, and exhaustion press into his chest. Soldiers who had fought alongside him, shouting prayers and falling screaming into the alien biomass, swirled in memory. The weight of command, the responsibility to countless lives, both above and below, pressed on him like iron. Tears blurred his vision. He wanted to scream, to rage at the unfairness, at the Xenos, at the Emperor. But there was no time, no justice, no recourse. Only the warhead, the countdown, and the knowledge that the only salvation left required sacrifice on a scale that would haunt him forever. Thor knelt and began the final sequence, fingers trembling over the activation console. Around him, the survivors murmured prayers, whispered names of the dead, and clutched one another. The soldier who had abandoned his regiment wiped his face, finally facing the pain he had tried to outrun for months. I can't believe I'm still alive to see this," he whispered. Thor's helmet fogged with sweat and tears. The mother placed her hand over his, squeezing it like a lifeline. "Do it," she urged softly, though every inch of her body screamed against it. "End it for all of us, for them." Thor swallowed the lump of grief and fear lodged in his throat. The world above, the screaming battlefield, the tide of living flesh, it all needed to stop. He had no other choice. Hesitation would condemn not just them, but the Imperium itself. As he activated the sequence, the warhead hummed louder, a deep resonant vibration that reverberated through the tunnels and into Thor's bones. The Xenos above and below convulsed at the faint tremor, responding even before the sonic wave reached them. The survivors clutched each other tighter, whispering final confessions, apologies, and blessings to those long lost. Thor felt the walls themselves pulse beneath him, as if the planet sensed its impending death. His tears streaked down, mingling with sweat and grime, and he could barely see through the chaos in his helmet's visor. A low, mournful chorus of whispers filled his mind. Human, alien, and something in between. Each syllable echoed loss. Each breath carried grief. And yet, in the center of the despair, a single spark of hope flickered. When the wave detonated, the nightmare would end. The countdown ticked mercilessly. Every second felt eternal. Thor hugged the mother, their foreheads touching briefly, sharing a silence heavy with understanding. "We will not be forgotten," he whispered, voice breaking. Around them, the soldier and other survivors nodded. Acceptance etched into their exhausted faces. They had all made peace with death. Thor glanced upward, imagining the battlefield above, the Titans stomping, the Marines and Guardsmen falling, the endless waves of evolving horror. And then he pressed the final key. The sonic warhead roared to life, a vibration that rippled through the tunnels, shaking the walls and rattling bones. The Xenos above reacted instantly, convulsing in a grotesque mirror of agony and terror. The energy surged outward, ready to claim every life in range, including those who had chosen to fight one final desperate battle. The blast detonated, a deafening wave of resonance that shook the planet and rattled every mind and muscle in its path. Flesh, bone, and corrupted terrain erupted, then shimmered and fractured, screaming into silence. The squad and survivors braced, holding hands and hearts alike, tears streaming freely as the world became a storm of sound and fury. Thor felt the mother's grip loosen in his, her final whisper, "Thank you." He closed his eyes, sobbing, knowing the nightmare would finally end, but at the cost of everyone he had fought to save. In that single, shattering moment, the weight of the Imperium, humanity, and personal loss collided. The Xenos would never rise again. The planet would live, but the price would haunt Thor and the galaxy forever. Thor stumbled from the smoking ruins of the tunnels, armor scorched and dented, limbs trembling from exhaustion and pain. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the world itself sought to drag him back into the nightmare below. The battlefield above was eerily silent, except for the occasional shriek of a collapsing biomass tower, the last echo of the Xenos resistance. Smoke swirled around the skeletal husks of Titans and shredded Marines alike, mingling with the acidic stench of the planet's corrupted flesh. He clutched his bolter, though its purpose had long vanished, and breathed through the soot and blood. Every nerve screamed, every memory clawed at him. The mother, the soldier, the cocooned children, the screams of comrades, the unending tide of living biomass that had consumed everything. He had survived, but barely. Survival came at the cost of everyone else. The Imperial fleet hung in orbit above the deadened world, massive vessels poised to purge the planet with fire and orbital bombardment. The surface, once a sprawling hive of life and industry, was now a tangled, pulsing landscape of scorched flesh, bone towers toppled, and rivers of blackened biomass. Thor craned his neck to see the horizon, each ruined city a grotesque monument to a nightmare finally quelled. Titans had fallen. Bolters were silent. Only scorched remnants remained, and in those remnants lay the ghosts of countless lives sacrificed to contain a horror beyond comprehension. His chest heaved as he watched the fleet's preparatory fire streak across the clouds, each shot a hammer blow against the corpse of the world, purifying it in ash. The universe seemed indifferent, yet the loss pressed into him like a weight impossible to cast off. Thor's mind wandered to the mother in the tunnels, to her whispered plea, "End this, let our deaths mean something." He could still see her pale, determined face, feel her trembling hand in his own as he keyed the sonic warhead. He could hear the soldier's shame, finally facing the guilt he had carried for months. The screams of the Xenos, the shattering pulse of the sonic blast, the tearing of biomass into silence. They all fused into one memory, seared into his mind. He had fought, survived, and won, but at what cost? The survivors he had protected were gone. Friends, innocents, and enemies alike were reduced to ashes, memories, or nightmares that would never fade. The weight of responsibility, the knowledge that he was the sole bearer of this story, crushed him more than any alien limb ever could. He fell to one knee on the observation deck of a hovering frigate, staring down at the scorched planet below. Every ruined city, every melted tower, every twisted mass of alien flesh shimmered faintly in the lingering heat of destruction. The Imperium's victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic monument to sacrifice beyond reckoning. The wind of the upper atmosphere stirred through his armor vents, whispering faintly, a sound almost like the echoes of those who had died beneath him. The emptiness pressed against his soul. He had survived, but what did survival mean when the universe exacted such a toll? What was victory if the cost was measured not in numbers or territory, but in shattered lives, stolen innocence, and the permanent scar left on the psyche of a single man who had seen hell incarnate and lived to tell the tale? Thor whispered, voice rough and ragged from smoke, dust, and grief, "If this is victory, what was the price?" The words carried no audience, no answer, but the soft hum of the frigate's engines and the distant, dying screams of the Xenos that had once enveloped the world. He closed his eyes briefly, a tear slipping from beneath the helmet's rim, mingling with soot and grime. Memories of screams, laughter, prayers, and pleas flooded his mind in a single crushing wave. He had survived, while others had not. The Imperium's will had triumphed. The fleet's weapons would burn the planet to ensure no resurgence. But even in triumph, he felt hollow. Hollow with loss, hollow with guilt, hollow with the haunting realization that victory could feel so meaningless. Then a faint whisper, not mechanical, not psychic in the way he expected. A single sibilant voice, cold and patient, calling his name. Thor. His eyes snapped open, scanning the darkening planet, and for a moment, nothing moved. But deep beneath the ashes, one pulse lingered, a fragment of the Xenos, alive, watching, waiting. Thor's heart froze. The nightmare had not been fully contained. One had survived. One whispered his name. And as the fleet began its final cleansing fire, he realized the war and the horror was far from over. The galaxy would feel this again, and Thor would be ready, or consumed.